They say the sky does not speak. But in 1877, it did. It spoke in thunder, in blood, in betrayal. A sound so fierce, it tore the silence of the hills. And the world gave it a name. Kiriji. The earth cracked. Men froze. Mothers screamed. It wasn't just a cannon. It was a cry. The scream of people who had bent long enough. And now, they rose. This was not just war. It was a memory. It was truth. It was thunder that still echoes in our bones. Listen closely. This is the story behind Kiriji, the 16 Years' War. Once upon a time, in the history of Yorubaland, there was a city that rose not through peace, but through conquest. Its name was Ibadan. It stood tall not just as a city, but as a symbol. A kingdom born from war, shaped by fire, and ruled by force. It was built by fugitives, hardened by survival, and sharpened by the blade. Its walls were not laid with peace treaties, but with the rubble of fallen empires. Its throne was not inherited, it was seized. And it sat boldly on the ashes of the old Oyo Empire. Ibadan did not ask for power. It took it. Ibadan did not ask. It took. It marched into lands without knocking. And when it spoke, towns listened. Or vanished. From Ekiti to Ijesha. From Igbomina to Ifon. Smaller kingdoms bent their knees. Or they bled. Tribute was demanded, not requested. Cowries. Palm oil. Men. And when the quotas weren't met, villages burned. Kings were dragged from palaces. Sons were snatched from mothers' arms. Ibadan sent war chiefs, not messengers. Its name was heavy. Its presence, terrifying. It did not fight for survival. It fought for dominance. And the land? It trembled beneath its boots. Yet beneath the soil, something stirred. Whispers in the forest. Anger in the hearts of fathers. Tears in the eyes of queens. The oppressed were gathering. And the empire did not see it coming. By the early 1870s, fear had become a familiar guest. It walked quietly through Ekiti's markets, stood tall in the palace halls of Ijesha, sat like a ghost at the fire circles of Ajeles and Igbomina. The Ibadan warriors came often, and they did not come in peace. And when towns delayed or resisted, punishment followed. Crops were burnt, messengers were silenced. Kings were disgraced before their people. And as Ibadan's power grew, so did the bitterness buried in those it ruled. But history does not stay silent forever. Far from Ibadan's ears, a shift began. In thick forests, at the edges of hills and valleys, elders, chiefs, warriors, hunters, they gathered in secret. From Ekiti, from Ijesha, from Igbomina, from Ajeles, and from others too small to name, but too proud to bow. These were not official meetings. No drums. No royal robes. No public declarations. Just quiet fires beneath dark trees. Men sitting on bare ground. Speaking in low tones. Voices heavy with memories. They shared stories of humiliation. Of families torn apart. Of kings who could no longer protect their people. They did not come as enemies. They came as survivors. And slowly, something ancient returned. Unity. The idea moved like wind. From mouth to mouth. From village to village. Alone, we are weak. But together, we are stronger than Ibadan. The forest became their council hall. Trust was rekindled between old rivals. Disputes were buried. And for the first time in a long time, Yorubas looked at each other, not as threats, but as brothers. This is how the Ekiti-Parapo was born. It was more than a name. It was an oath. They swore never to pay another tribute. They swore to fight, if Ibadan returned. They swore, even if death came knocking, they would never kneel again. And this pact, it wasn't sealed with signatures. It was sealed with blood and silence. Those who agreed knew the cost. War was coming. And once the first strike was made, there would be no turning back. Among the voices rising in this new alliance was one man whose anger burned hotter than most. He was Fabunmi of Okemesi. He was young, fiery, and feared in battle. Fabunmi had seen too much suffering. His people had lost everything to Ibadan's tax collectors, to their warlords. Their pride was gone. Their warriors were weary. Their markets were silent. And when the news came that Ibadan would return, that another tribute would be demanded, something in him snapped. Fabunmi stood. And he did not speak with royal language. He spoke like a son of the land. He said, "We will not kneel again." He said it again. Slower. Louder. "We will not kneel again. Not to Ibadan. Not to anyone. If it means death, so be it. But no one will come to Okemesi and walk out with our dignity." There was no more debate. The Ekiti-Parapo was no longer just an idea. It became an army in the making. Warriors began training in secret. Messengers ran through hidden forest paths. Hunters carved fresh arrows. Blacksmiths sharpened blades, long dulled by years of silence. The wind in Yorubaland began to change. And Ibadan, it did not yet know that the fire it started in the villages had become something else entirely. Something that would soon roar across the hills like thunder. In 1878, Ibadan sent a message to Ikea, one of the Ekiti towns still under its control. It was the same old demand: tribute, taxes, submission. And to make sure their message was obeyed, they sent an Ajele. These Ajeles were not diplomats. They were symbols of oppression, infamous for their arrogance, their cruelty, and the unchecked power they wielded over local communities. When the Ajele arrived in Ikea, he acted just like the others. He insulted the town's chiefs, extorted from the people, and reminded everyone that Ibadan was still the master. But this time, something changed. Fabunmi was in Ikea, and he had seen enough. He stepped forward and confronted the Ajele publicly, something no one had dared to do before. People watched in disbelief as the two men faced off. The Ajele laughed at him, threatened him, dismissed him. But Fabunmi didn't step back. His rage had reached its limit. Then, in a moment that would echo through history, Fabunmi drew his sword and killed the Ajele. It wasn't a quiet assassination. It was loud, open, defiant. Blood spilled in the street. The symbol of Ibadan's power lay dead. A line had been crossed, and it could never be uncrossed. But the people of Ikea did not panic. They didn't run. They stood up. The youth picked up arms. The same chiefs who had once stayed silent gave quiet nods of support. Word of the killing spread quickly. Fabunmi had killed an Ajele. Okemesi had risen. And suddenly, silence was no longer an option. When Ibadan heard the news, they were furious. But more than that, they were shocked. They never expected rebellion from a small town. From a young man without a royal title. They began to prepare their retaliation. But by then, the land had already changed. Fabunmi's act lit a flame across Yorubaland. Towns that had once hesitated now joined the cause. The Ekiti-Parapo movement gained strength. Warriors trained openly. Hunters, farmers, even traders began preparing for war. People who had never held a weapon before stood up and said, "Enough." Fabunmi became a symbol not just of anger, but of hope. If he could strike Ibadan, maybe others could too. Maybe, for the first time in decades, Ibadan could be stopped. Maybe the lion could bleed. But the truth was heavier than anyone expected. Fabunmi had started something far beyond himself. A war was coming, one that would last 16 years, stretch across Yorubaland, and cost more than anyone imagined. He had set fire to the forest. And the fire had started to spread. He wasn't ready. No one was. But history had already made its choice. And there was no turning back. The town of Ijesh had shown sympathy to the Ekiti-Parapo cause. And Ibadan was watching. But this time, Ibadan wasn't alone. The Ilorin Emirate, which also had problems with the rising Eastern Alliance, joined the fight. With Ibadan's support, Ilorin sent a strong army, well-trained, well-armed, and ready for battle. Their target was Ijesh. They expected little resistance. A quick strike. An easy defeat. But what they ran into was something they didn't understand yet, a new kind of Yoruba army. By this point, the Ekiti-Parapo alliance had begun to evolve. They had access to modern firearms, smuggled in with the help of European missionaries and local traders. The once fractured towns had started to train together, to march together, to bleed together. And in Ikirun, they were waiting. Ilarin's army came in, expecting an easy victory. But what they met shocked them. The Ekiti-Parapo warriors were ready not just with guns, but with cannons. It was the first time that kind of weapon was used in a Yoruba war. The sound was loud and deep, it shook the hills, the trees, even the sky itself. Kiriji. That was the sound. And that's how the war got its name. It echoed across the land like the heavens had opened in rage. That single, earth-shattering sound became the name of the war, Kiriji. The War of Thunder. The war of cannon fire. The war that made the ground tremble. The Ilarin army was crushed. So many Ilarin and Ibadan armies were killed. And at the center of this transformation stood one man, a warrior whose name would echo across generations, Ogedengbe Agbogungboro, the unbreakable one. Ogedengbe wasn't just a fighter. He was a strategist, a spiritual symbol, and a commander who inspired both fear and loyalty. He hailed from Ijesha, and long before the Kiriji War began, his name already meant something in Yorubaland. He had once fought under the Ibadan banner in previous campaigns. But when he saw the truth, how Ibadan ruled over the eastern towns like cattle to be used and discarded, he made a choice. He walked away. He crossed to the other side. And when he did, everything changed. Ogedengbe didn't just bring his sword to the Ekiti-Parapo cause. He brought vision. He brought structure. He brought command. Under his leadership, the loose alliance of rebels and town defenders became something else entirely, a coalition. A real army. And by this time, it wasn't just Ekiti anymore. Towns across the eastern Yoruba world, Ijesha, Igbomina, Ile, Akako, Ifon, Igborodo, and parts of Ondo began to send men, weapons, and supplies. The momentum was growing. This was no longer a scattered resistance. This was becoming a movement. Camp bases were built in Emisi Isle, which became the unofficial headquarters of the Ekiti-Parapo. Hills were fortified. Watchtowers were erected. Scouts and runners carved hidden communication lines between villages, using forest paths and coded signs. This was no longer just a collection of angry towns. It was now a unified army, and Ogedengbe stood firmly at its helm. But this was not a European army. This was a Yoruba force, trained in gun formations, yes, but also grounded in something deeper, spirit. Before every campaign, warriors turned to diviners, oracle master and priestesses, to read omens, cast cowries, and ask the gods for guidance. Some were given charms, red cloth amulets soaked in blood and herbs, believed to turn away bullets. Others wore sacred tattoos, spiritual armor to protect their souls if they died in battle. Training camps were hidden deep within the forests. There, young men learned more than how to shoot. They learned to move without sound, to read animal tracks, to hear the wind and what it carried, to become one with the land they were fighting for. These were not just fighters. These were guardians sharpened by both steel and spirit. And they were not alone. The Ekiti-Parapo army was not built by men alone. Women played roles that history too often forgets. In marketplaces and palaces, women worked as spies. They carried messages between towns, hidden in calabashes, sewn into clothes, whispered in songs only they understood. Some were trained fighters, skilled with short blades and ambush tactics, especially in towns like Ijesha and Ikol. Others were queens and priestesses, leaders who blessed the warriors before battle, organized supply chains, and commanded deep respect across kingdoms. This was not just a war of warriors. This was a people's war. And in this war, everyone fought with guns, with prayers, with courage. With every new victory, the Ekiti-Parapo alliance grew stronger. More towns pledged allegiance. More warriors enlisted. More cannons were built. And more gunfire echoed through the forests of the Yoruba heartland. But the price was steep. As the war dragged on, it became more brutal. Villages were burned. Innocents were caught in the crossfire. And though the Ekiti-Parapo had the thunder of cannons on their side, Ibadan wasn't finished. Reinforcements arrived. Old alliances shifted. Enemies grew more desperate. The war was no longer about tribute or pride. It had become a fight for survival. But in the hearts of the people, something had changed. Hope had returned. Because now, when the cannons roared, they weren't speaking for the empire, they were speaking for the people. And every time the sky cracked open with another Kiriji blast, the world was reminded. The empire would no longer rule without resistance. The warriors of thunder had risen. And they would not be silenced. What began as a firestorm became something no one could contain. A war that many thought would end in months dragged on for 16 long years. From 1877 to 1893, the hills of Ekiti, the forests of Ijesha, the plains of Igbomina, and the roads to Ibadan were soaked with dust, smoke, and blood. Entire generations were swallowed by it. Towns that once rang with music and market laughter became silent ruins. Famine settled in. Fields were abandoned. Wells dried. And disease crept from hut to hut like an invisible army. Children were born into war. Some never knew what peace sounded like. Alliances shifted. Trust was broken. Betrayals turned into strategy. Some towns sold secrets just to survive. Others turned on their neighbors in the name of negotiation. There were moments when it wasn't clear who was friend and who was foe. Love letters were written on banana leaves but never reached their destinations. Lovers waited under moonlight for warriors that never returned. Weddings were postponed, then cancelled, then forgotten. Fathers buried their sons. And sometimes, sons returned home to find their fathers already in the ground. People stopped counting the number of cannon blasts. The sound of Kiriji became normal, a background rhythm of life. But the pain never felt normal. Still, the war refused to end. The Ekiti-Parapo stood firm, refusing to kneel. Ibadan, too proud to retreat, kept sending men into battle. And between them, the land itself, sacred Yorubaland, began to wither. This was no longer a war about tribute. It had become a war about the future. About identity. About who would write the next chapter of Yoruba history. But just beyond the gun smoke, another power was watching. One with polished shoes, quiet voices, and sharper knives. The British didn't start the war. But they ended it, not with weapons, but with contracts. While Yoruba sons fought each other in the bush, the British stood calmly on the coast, watching, trading, waiting. They watched Ibadan bleed. They watched the Ekiti-Parapo starve. And when both sides were too weak to stand, they moved in as peacekeepers. In 1886, they forced a treaty between the warring parties. It ordered both Ibadan and the Ekiti-Parapo to withdraw, to cease fire, to submit to British mediation and oversight. But the guns didn't truly fall silent until 1893, the year the British formally took control of Yorubaland. They had studied the war carefully. They saw the exhaustion, the divisions, the desperation. And they knew this was the perfect time to strike, not with an army, but with a handshake. They didn't come waving flags. They came with railways, with missions, with contracts and civilization. And they found a people too tired to resist. The war had destroyed the old empires. Ibadan's dominance crumbled. The Ekiti-Parapo alliance dissolved. And from the ashes of a 16-year war, a new ruler emerged. The sword was replaced by the pen. The kings who once commanded armies now bowed before district officers. And the children of warriors were taught to sing hymns in foreign tongues. Yorubaland would never be the same again. But still, even now, they say if you go deep into the forest, where the soil is red and the trees still whisper stories, put your ear to the ground. Listen closely. You might still hear it. Kiriji. Kiriji. The sound of thunder. The sound of resistance. The sound of a people who once stood and refused to kneel.